We're happy to be joined today by three speakers, all of whom work with Cornell University. Brian Richards is a member of Cornell's Soil and Water Group and the project director for a USDA NEPA sustainable bioenergy project looking at the impacts of perennial grass bioenergy feedstocks grown on wetness-prone marginal lands in New York. He and his team are measuring trace gas emissions and soil carbon trends in addition to yields and soil health parameters at sites growing switchgrass, reed canary grass, and starting next spring, miscanthus. Peter Woodbury is the second speaker. He's a senior research associate in soil and crop sciences at Cornell University. He develops and uses different kinds of computer models, including geospatial analyses, to quantify the sustainability of agricultural and forest ecosystems and to improve agricultural and environmental management and policy. With multidisciplinary teams, including NewBio, he is investigating the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and challenges for sustainable bioenergy systems at farm, landscape, state, and national scales. He also works with multidisciplinary teams on other topics, such as improving the sustainability of maize production under climate change. Julie Hansen is our third speaker. She's a member of the Cornell School of Integrative Plant Science in the Plant Breeding and Genetics section. Julie is also a project collaborator for the NewBio Switchgrass Feedstock Improvement and Sustainability Groups. The forage breeding project team that she works with has been managing and harvesting switchgrass breeding nurseries and field trials for biomass yield and quality since 2007. We'll hear from all of them today on many of those projects that I've just touched on. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to them so they can get into some of these really interesting pieces. Looking forward to hearing about them.
Thank you, Sarah. Brian Richards here. And again, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity for us to talk to you all about what we're doing. Generally, we don't get very far into a presentation about marginal lands before someone raises their hand and says, well, what exactly do you mean by marginal lands? And I found this interesting quote that I really like that reflects that marginal land seems to have many different meanings depending on who's talking. And this quote with the writer say that word marginal has perhaps been too glibly used in recent years, apparently little more than a convenient expression for land that is barren, rough, inaccessible, or possessed of other undesirable characteristics or relationships. And the reason I like this quote is it dates back to 1932, Peterson and Galbraith in the Journal of Farm Economics. And in some ways, a lot hasn't changed because marginal lands tends to be used subjectively. But as Peterson and Galbraith point out, marginal is at its root, it's an economic term used to describe lands that are going out of production or have gone out of production because they can't be economically farmed due to any of a number of biophysical factors. And they also point out that the specifics of what constitutes marginality will vary with the time and place and the agroeconomic context. Now, a lot of us who have had either agronomy or ag economics in our background, this is some basic concepts that we've seen before, but we realize that not everyone has seen this, and this gets to the root of what constitutes marginality. So we'll do a quick run through of this whole concept of yield response and economic return from a farm system. So with this plot, this is a typical yield response curve that would be developed on soil using a large number of different trials. On the x-axis, we have our rate of input, typically the amount of fertilizer, but it also could be, the intensity of cultivation or a range of different inputs into the farming system. But for the sake of this illustration, let's call it the fertilizer rate. And on the y-axis is the yield in terms of the tons per acre that you would get. And as you can see, it increases in response to increasing inputs. Here at the left side of the graph, you get a very high efficiency. You get a lot of bang for your buck out of the first few pounds of fertilizer that you add per acre. But as you increase your loading, the return the effect diminishes, and you end up with a low incremental efficiency. And eventually you'll reach what people call the critical point, where you will get no additional yield benefit from this input. If you're talking in terms of soil fertility, the fertilizer you're adding is no longer limiting the yield response you're seeing. Okay, and so again, this is a basic yield response curve that's very well understood. Now, let's talk not simply in terms of the yield or in terms of tons per acres, but let's talk in terms of income. So, x-axis, again, we have the input fertilizer rate, but now the y-axis is the dollars per acre we're realizing from our crop. So our crop income, our return from agriculture. And again, this is a very simplified approach, but I think it's a helpful thing. So it's one thing to get income from your crop, but you also have to recognize that there are costs. And there's two kinds of costs involved in production. What we call fixed costs, they are flat irrespective of what is going on in terms of our input rate. So this is the cost of land or the cost of plowing and planting. It doesn't matter what your yield is, the cost of those doesn't change. But then there are also variable costs. And again, if we're talking fertilizer is our input, then the more you put on, the more it costs. So it's an increasing function. And then the top of that variable cost line, the orange line, is the total of those two costs, the fixed and the variable costs. Okay, up here at our critical point where our yield is maximized, the difference, this red arrow shows our net profit from our operation, our income from the crop minus the total costs. Now it's very important to realize that the maximum yield is not the point of maximum income. That's because if you look at the difference between these two plots, the maximum distance occurs further to the left at a lower rate of loading back when the fertilizer was giving you more bang for the buck. So the peak return is the point at which the income is maximized, even though the yield is not maximized. Okay, so let's proceed, and for simplicity, we're just going to use a single cost line. Here we go. So the total costs are represented by the orange line, and again, that represents both fixed and variable. A lot of these fertilizer response curves were developed in ag experiment stations, and they tended to be done on prime soil. And when you start to look at a poor soil, you realize that the yield curve and then the resulting income curve is lower. You see a lower critical point and a lower point of peak return, both in terms of it occurs at lower input rates, but you can see the magnitude in terms of the profit per acre is almost half. So this is a poor soil. And where we get to marginal soils, which are defined as the point where you're breaking even, this is a soil where those same inputs are going to yield much less in the sense of potential return. And here you see we're basically breaking even, and the point of peak return is at a very low level of input. Now going to bioenergy cropping, again, a lot of these cost return curves tended to have been done for our major agroeconomic crops. But with bioenergy crops, we are focusing on subprime soils so that we're not competing for food and fiber on our best farmlands. So I still have these same poor and marginal soil returns, and our hope is that with perennial cropping using second generation crops such as willow and switchgrass and other perennial grasses, we have a lower total cost function, and then the possibility of returns that, again, that's nothing compared to growing corn, but we hope to have profitable returns on poor and what are called marginal soils. We did a paper early this year. It's called Reporting on Marginal Lands for Bioenergy Feedstock Production, a modest proposal. And it's a very short one that's available on Bioenergy Research. And my email will be at the end, and I'd be glad to send a copy to anyone who wants it. We observed when we were looking at the literature that the number of publications that reference the word marginal, that's the gray shaded area, has really jumped up in the last 30, 40 years. And those that are referencing marginal land and bioenergy, which are the black lines, have similarly spiked, especially in the last couple decades. But what was quite interesting is we were looking at if and how marginal was defined in those papers. If it was used subjectively or if there was some quantification given. And we found that it was defined specifically in only about half the papers that were about marginal lands and bioenergy. In another third, it was only defined implicitly, and in 16% there was no definition given at all. Our favorite was the paper that had marginal in the title, and that was the last you saw it in the entire paper. Of those who define marginal land implicitly, those who did only referred to biophysical. In other words, they were talking about soils that had various problems, and only 16% of those who had implicit definitions referred to the fact that it was a biophysical and economic situation, and then only 8% referenced it economically. So this is a kind of an interesting finding, and our modest proposal in our paper is, if you write about marginal lands and bioenergy, tell us why the land is marginal in terms of what is the what's the context in which you're using this term. Interestingly, we thought this was a fairly straightforward paper. Some of the reviewers are saying, well, isn't soil classification enough? If you simply report the soil series, that should be all that anyone needs to know. And again, that assumes people are simply looking at the biophysical characteristics and not the overall economic context. And my favorite recent quote in this regard, we just had an email exchange a couple of weeks ago, and Stacy Bonas from Rutgers was writing about many fields that were not officially documented as marginal, but they're not used for ag crops anymore due to lack of organic matter or nutrient levels, to the point where it's not economical, so farmers just give up on the land. The not economical and farmers just giving up on the land is what represents a marginal soil, not whether or not someone has officially listed that soil series as a marginal land or not. So I thought that was a very, very useful and timely quote. Now, causes of marginality, I won't read this whole list here, but all of these characteristics of a soil, they can together act to lower the yield or increase the management cost or increase the risk. Again, you may have a fine time 3 years out of 5, but you can lose the crop the other 2 years, and you can't make a go of that. And the specifics of what constitutes a marginal soil, again, it varies with time and place and economic context. My favorite example here is we have a lot of marginal dairy lands in the Finger Lakes region of New York. They're now doing just fine as wineries. The soil didn't change, but the economic context did. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Peter Woodbury to talk.
Thanks, Brian, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we've done trying to estimate at the very broad regional to national scale what kinds of land and how much land might be available for feedstock production, and what kind of yields might we expect to get on that land. So we've looked, our starting point for this analysis was looking for land that would not be competing with current agricultural production. So I'm going to talk about this set of land that's not currently cropland. It's not forest land, because we're not envisioning cutting down forests to plant grasses or willow. It does include marginal land, but it also can include non-marginal lands, higher productivity lands that aren't currently being harvested. So basically this is rural land that's in some kind of perennial herbaceous vegetation, but is apparently not being harvested. So I'll call this herbaceous land for short. We also looked at current row crop land because certainly some of that may be used for bioenergy production, and the way we kind of put a boundary on that was to look at trends in the yield of major crops over time, and because of increasing crop yields in the future, say 10 years from now, we could produce the same amount of total agricultural production we produce now on a little bit less land. So we tried to quantify how much land that might be. I'm not going to talk very much about the methods that we used. I did make a presentation a year and a half ago to this group. You can look back to this April 2013 presentation if you want some more details. So here are some results of what we came up with for potentially available herbaceous non-crop land. So each dot here represents 20,000 hectares. And if we just focus on the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, we can see quite a few dots in Maine and in New York and in Pennsylvania. And that's all representing this land that we believe is not currently being harvested, that could be available for bioenergy feedstock production. As I mentioned, to think about cropland, we looked at trends in yield for 35 major crops since 1960. So I'm just showing two examples here. The top panel is for corn in New York State, and you can see a very strong linear trend. So we projected this trend 10 years into the future and said we can produce current production on a little bit less land because the yield is increasing. The bottom panel shows similar data for grass hay, again in New York State, just as an example. We did this separately for each state. In this case, we don't see any linear trend here. It looks like maybe it was increasing for some time, but in recent decades it's been flat. So we would project that there wouldn't be future increases in the yield of grass hay under this type of management. So here are the results for what we're calling potentially available cropland. And the pattern simply follows where the cropland is. So we're talking about essentially a fraction of current cropland. So that fraction is going to be basically just reflecting where there is a lot of cropland. So we see only a few dots in our region, and lots of dots in the Corn Belt, where there's such a great deal of row crop agriculture. So this is a summary for selected states of each of these two kinds of land. The cropland area is black bars, and the herbaceous or non-crop area is the dark red bars. So what we tend to see in some of our northeastern states is much more land that could be available that's not currently cropland. And if we get into Ohio, into the edge of the Corn Belt, we see a lot more cropland based on the way we did our calculations. So we're also interested at this very broad scale of trying to estimate what kind of total feedstock production might we get. And to do this, we used an index called the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, which integrates a number of biophysical factors that affect yield. So it's mostly soil factors with a little bit of climate. So the green colors here show higher values of this index, and the red colors show lower values. So in our region, you see the lowest values in the Appalachian Mountain chain and the higher values in the lower lands where our croplands tend to be. So I want to show this graph for a couple of reasons. One is this is just showing on the x-axis this index value, which goes from 0 to 1. So an increasing index value means higher productivity land. And then on the vertical axis is the yield. And this is showing a couple of things. One is there's a fairly linear relationship between this index and actual crop yield. So these are our corn yields in this case. A fairly linear relationship. There is a lot of scatter. But using this index helps us start to get at this question of marginal lands, because at the lower values of this index, we're getting much lower yields. And at some point, you're going to cross that threshold where the yield is too low to pay back the costs of production. So putting these two estimates together about potentially available land and potential yields, we can make some kind of what we think of as bounding estimates, or what might be the highest amount of feedstock production that we could imagine. Now, one thing I haven't really talked about is, for a number of reasons, for the herbaceous land in particular, we don't expect that all of that really could be available and used for bioenergy feedstock production. People have different goals for their land, and it doesn't always include production, especially for lands that are not currently in production. So based on some work that we did in New York State, this graph, we're just showing half of that herbaceous land, but we're including all of the cropland that we identified as potentially available, under the assumption that that's already being cropped, and it's likely to continue to be cropped either for bioenergy feedstocks or for another crop. So the blue bars here show our estimates for selected states of total potential production. And the red bars show the results from the billion-ton update report. And most of you are probably familiar with that report, but if not, it's a national, quite a substantial effort to come up with an estimate of feedstock production potential for every county and state in the country. So I'm showing these estimates together because we did use different methodologies, and I find it interesting that over a multi-state region, we may come up with fairly similar estimates. Although for individual states, we might estimate more than the billion-ton report or vice versa. So this slide is just getting back to this point of how much of this potentially available land really might come into production. And as I said, we don't think all of it will, particularly for the herbaceous land. So the herbaceous land is shown in the taller brown bars here. And the different height bars is just different assumptions about the percentage of this land that might actually come into play and produce feedstocks. So if we assume that 80% of, and I think a very ambitious goal, there's quite a bit of land and quite a bit of production. If we think only 5 or 10% of this land might come into play, then the production is much lower. So this slide is really just pointing out that as we think about scaling up the industry, this is a question we really need to understand. And this gets back to the marginal lands question of what is the production potential on those lands, what's the economic return on those lands, but also the social question of what do people want to do with the land. So we have completed this regional and national analysis, but I don't want to leave the impression that we think that's the final answer. Making these kind of estimates needs to be an iterative process, and some of the next steps are being carried out within the New Bio project. So for example, we need to get a better handle on the feedstock yield potential, especially on these marginal lands. And Julie Hansen is going to speak to you in just a moment about exactly that topic. We also need to understand better the economics of production. And other folks within New Bio are working on that topic. And this is a slide that Wei Jiang produced. Again, just emphasizing that there are multiple aspects to the question of marginal land. So now I'm going to turn it over to Julie Hansen to talk about this question of feedstock production potential on marginal lands.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter and Brian. So we have been able to plant various warm season perennial grasses at the Cornell University Ag Experiment Station lands that we have available. And many of these lands are marginal, being poorly drained. They have restricted rooting depths, low pH, some high elevation, but although they have these different characteristics, one thing they all have in common is that they are highly variable. So you'll have spots in the field that are better than others and worse than others. So we've grown different warm season grass species, but this talk is going to focus on the yields of the switchgrass because that was the highest yielding warm season grass species that we worked with. So we work with different experimental units so that we harvest. So this is just an example of one of our breeding nurseries in Ithaca where we have plants that, of individual plants of switchgrass on a 3-foot by 3-foot grid or 1 meter square. This is so we can go in and look at each individual plant and look at how it's reacting to the environment it's planted in, reacting to the different biotic and abiotic stresses it's being exposed to. And that way, in our breeding program, we're able to pick out the best plants to go forward with in the breeding program. Certainly in switchgrass, there's a high amount of genetic diversity. So we are able to find, readily find large, well-adapted plants to the different fields that they're planted in. This particular field had a high clay content, and so there were plants that were thriving in that type of an environment. So there's a lot of potential for improvement of switchgrass yields on marginal lands through plant breeding. Another size of plot or experimental unit that we harvest are these replicated plot trials. So each treatment or variety is planted in a small land area and then harvested. So these trials work very well for comparing relative differences amongst the entries in the trial, say varieties, seed treatments, planting dates, those sorts of things. So these trials, this is an example, an overview of one where you see the large rectangles are the actual replicates of this trial, and then the part highlighted in yellow is a single plot. So that's a single unit that would be harvested. For both the breeding nurseries and this type of a replicated plot trial, the harvesting losses are minimal. We either harvest the individual plants by hand, or we have research equipment that we use to harvest these plots that really there's very little loss. So everything that is there is captured and weighed, and we get nice samples for dry matter corrections on all of these plots. And the third type of field experiments that we have are these strip trials. The strip trials, each strip can be replicated or sometimes not replicated, and they're usually strips that are larger, at least an acre or more in size. This particular slide shows a field of different warm season grass species. One thing that these strip trials have is they cover the variation in the field. So they're a little harder to pin down exactly what's going on in them. They are harvested with field scale or commercial farm equipment. So it gets you closer to what a realistic estimate that a producer could use in making plans on what to do with their land and whether to grow bioenergy crops and switchgrass or not. And so these are the yields that you would want to talk to the farmer about. So there are field losses when you go over and harvest switchgrass with this type of equipment. Some of the grass may not be harvested. If it's in a wet spot and you might get your tractor stuck, they generally go around those, so those are not even harvested. And then there's the switchgrass that gets cut but not put into a bale that's left behind also. So there's some lodging losses. So generally the yields in the strip trials are going to be lower than what we see in our other types of experimental units. So just before I get into some of the yield data, I just want to go back to the beginning. All of these trials start right here with this small, very small seed, the a warmer soil temperature to germinate compared to our normal cool season grasses. And this is just a shot of some newly germinated seedlings that we had in a small plot trial, a replicated plot trial. These seedlings are very sensitive to the environment as far as like being dry from dry spells. They can die easily from dry spells, from disease, from being too wet, too cold, shaded by weeds, and all of those factors. So these seedlings need to get through this very critical stage before you can actually have an established stand. There are two types of switchgrass, two ecotypes, and they're adapted to different areas. So the upland types are adapted to zones 3 through 5. And these, if a farmer came today and said, "What should I plant?" this is what would be recommended, particularly for a marginal soil. The lowland ecotypes tend to be higher yielding, they also have much smaller seed size, about half, the seed's about half the size of the upland types. They are typically found on floodplains and native stands, and they're taller and they much longer, take longer to mature, but they may winter kill. So these are the two types that are available, and for the purposes of all of our strip trials, we've focused totally on the upland types since they have the best chance of surviving at this point. This is a good establishment of an upland type of switchgrass on a marginal field. You can see the ponding of water and so on. But one real problem with marginal fields is it can take a long time for them to dry out, and so you end up planting much later than you would like. And that's what happened in this particular case, where although these seedlings are coming right along and growing and look like they're going to be just fine, they really did not get big enough at this first establishment year to make it through the winter. So not all of them, some of them died, and so we had to go in with a no-till drill to reestablish this field the next year. So these are some of the challenges that take place when you're working with these marginal fields. Another issue with planting date and switchland ecotypes, this is a particular replicated plot trial that we were doing planting dates. So this trial was sown on July 20th in 2012, and you can see clearly that the upland type did establish pretty well, but the lowland type did not establish at all. All the plants that were there in the seeding year died and were not there in the next year. So in 2014 we did harvest this trial. The upland yielded 3 to 4 tons the acre and the lowland was 0. So you know, later planting dates are not don't work very well for the lowland types, whereas the upland types are more tolerant of this activity. Now to go back to the strip trials and the yields, this is a compilation of several trials together, but you can see two varieties that were planted in the strip trials. One, the red line is cave and rock, which is very well adapted and does well in most areas, not just in the Northeast, but other areas of the United States. And then sunburst, this is a variety developed in South Dakota and tends to be shorter in maturity, so it actually matures in August rather than later in the fall. And so you can see clearly in this graph that the two varieties in the first year, of course you don't harvest it in the first year, so your yields are nothing in the first year, 0. The second year you tend to get about half to 2/3 of your full establishment year yields. So sunburst yielded about 1 ton per acre, and cave and rock was about 2.5 tons per acre. And this is dry matter yield, not hay equivalent. So just dry matter. And cave and rock in the third, fourth years averaged almost 4 tons the acre, whereas sunburst was about 3. So these are very, you know, what you could expect yields at this point in time for farmers growing switchgrass on marginal fields. You can see a response by adding fertilizer, specifically nitrogen, to these fields. So not all fields have shown this trend, but in this graph you can clearly see a trend going from 0 pounds per acre of nitrogen to 50 to 100. So I'd just like to say that I'm going to turn this back to Brian now, and he's going to talk more about a comprehensive experiment he's done on this type of marginal land. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, so as we mentioned before, you know, so much research has been done on prime lands, but if we are seeking to promote bioenergy production on marginal lands, well then our research ought to be done on those same kind of lands. You're seeing an overhead here of our primary site taking early this fall, where we are growing a number of perennial grass treatments. Now, this is a standalone project that's been funded by USDA NIFA in their Sustainable Bioenergy Program. And our project goals are to understand how perennial grass species, that nitrogen loading, and drainage status in wetness-prone marginal soils affect the yields, the soil carbon trends, and the emissions of both nitrous oxide and methane. Our primary field site, I like to refer to it as the poster child of marginal soils. Cornell has had this for at least 50 years. The living memory doesn't go back much beyond that. But Cornell's never been able to use it intensively beyond occasional haying or mowing just to keep the shrubs down for at least 50 years. And that's despite some surface drainage work that was done. You can see the snake pattern. Those are surface drainage ways that were put in to try to drain out the worst of the land. The inset on the left, the dark blue color represents borderline poorly drained lands. The light blue is somewhat poorly. And the light green are the few areas that qualify as moderately well drained, and that's basically due to slope in most cases. So this is our primary site. And what we've done is we have laid out long strips that are about an acre each. There's 16 of them going across the field, across the wetness gradients. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we have quadruplicate randomized block strip plots, and our 4 cropping treatments are 1 fallow control, 2 reed canary grass with nitrogen, 3 switchgrass, and 4 switchgrass with nitrogen. And down in the lower right corner you can see some of the details in terms of our varieties and loading. But the distinctive of this approach that we're using is we took our soil moisture meter and did a survey when we set out these field plots, and you can see that color contour graph. And we laid out across each strip plot 5 monitoring subplots, trying to catch the wettest, the driest, and 3 in between intermediate moisture levels in terms of the soil moisture. We wanted to capture the range of soil wetness across each plot and look at that impact on, again, the yield, the soil carbon trends, and the emissions. That's a total of 80 subplots at this that we're monitoring intensively at this site. This plot shows that this has actually been a successful approach. Each time we do soil moisture readings across the field, we calculate the field average, and then we calculate the ratio of each individual subplot to that field average and keep track of that over time. And then finally bin these into 5 wetness classes. We call them the wetness quintiles. The blue is the wettest sites, and you can see they're what we call the water content ratio. So they tend to have soil moisture contents that are 1.3 times the field average, whereas the driest quintile on the right in orange, they tend to have moisture contents that are less than 0.8 times the field average. So we're looking at this recurring wetness, recurring pattern of how the soils, how wet the soils are, and we use this as an interpretive framework for all of our other work. We're also, by virtue of those surface drainage ways, we were able to put in a weir so we can measure the total site outflow, and we put in a few tiles, drainage tiles, to help make sure we didn't lose tractors in the wettest areas. And they have an outlet above this weir. So this weir is actually measuring the total outflow from the site to help us characterize the overall site hydrology. This is our second wet summer on wetness-prone soils, and as Peter and Julie have talked about, it's not the whole field and it's not wet all the time, but we do have some wet spots that have been very wet this year. And when mallards show up and decide to stay for a few days, you know you have a wetness-prone marginal soil. Nonetheless, we were able to get our grass harvested both last year and this year successfully. I'm just going to give a couple quick updates in terms of a sampling of the kind of data that we're looking at. Here we see Julie and Jamie and the team doing some work measuring the yield at the subplot level. So again, yield studies were done using frames around each subplot, and not only total biomass, but they hand sorted and weighed the target crop as well as weeds. So for the control plots, this is here on the left, and we have dry tons per acre, and in a minute you'll see, those of you who want metric, megagrams per hectare will appear on the right. So the control we're looking at yields in the between 1 and 2 tons per acre. This is dry matter. And this is largely, the site is dominated by reed canary grass that was planted long ago. In terms of the areas where we planted reed canary grass and have nitrogen fertilization, we see higher yields closer to 2 tons per acre. The red bars are the target crop, and then the green is total biomass when you add in weeds. So you can see the reed canary grass dominates these sites, and it doesn't care too much about the wetness. On the x-axis, the suffixes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 represent the wetness quintile, with, again, the 1s being the wettest and the 5s being the driest. Let's see, and let's advance here and also show the switchgrass and the switchgrass plus N plots. And here we see a marked response to the wetness quintiles. The switchgrass has had the hardest time establishing in these wetter areas. You can see the yields are 1/3 to 1/2, and it's best established in the driest quintiles. Now these switchgrass numbers are looking much better than they did last year. And again, this is we had to reseed due to some crop failure the first year, so this is 3rd year production. And I fully expect, based on what we're seeing, that the switchgrass will catch up in these wetter 1s and 2s subplot areas. You also notice, especially for the switchgrass at plus N, there's still a fair amount of weed competition. This is reed canary grass, and it's been quite a battle, but the switchgrass is beginning to be to take some ascendancy here. We're also doing a range of soil carbon work, and just for brevity, I'm just showing the organic matter as an analog for it. And this is another case of showing why it's so important to look at the wetness class as you're looking at the soils. Again, the same suffixes, the 1s are the wettest, the 5s are the driest on the right side. So here's our control plots. The red bars are pre-plow in the first year, and then we had some carbon loss due to plowing. Actually, not in the control plots, but you'll see in the other ones. But you see a pattern relating to the soil wetness, and here are the other sites. You see a marked year 1 to year 2 loss of carbon due to cultivation and some recovery. But the reason I put this in, again, just to show the importance of taking this approach of taking into account the soil wetness, because if you lump all your subplots together in a given cropping treatment, the noise will overwhelm any signal that you're trying to see. We also have emissions work going on. We have a flux tower which can tell us what's going on in terms of overall trends in nitrous oxide, but it's a field scale system. It can't distinguish the subplot level treatments. And for that, we have an extensive array of soil chambers that we put out that let us look at how the crop, the loading, the wetness are affecting the methane and nitrous oxide. And these are pretty intensive. At the main S1 site, we run 120 chambers when we do a chamber campaign, and our secondary site, there's 36. This data there's too much to look at today, but I'll just want to point out that this is a major effort that's underway. Looking ahead, we're looking forward to this next growing season for, again, yields and emissions. We'll be doing detailed soil profiles for carbon and rooting depth and other carbon studies, integrate our chamber and flux tower emissions, and we're excited that we got some additional federal formula funds to establish some miscanthus plots adjacent to this site, just to the right of where we're looking at this in this photo, using the same wetness gradient approach. And I wanted to especially say we have a big site, a lot of room, and collaboration is really invited. We have some collaborators doing some work with us, but we have lots of room for a lot more. And I'll close by pointing out that we've had a seminar with the same title that you see here. And at the end of the first year, Catalina Stuff, our very capable and recently departed postdoc, who's now taken up a faculty position back in the Netherlands, she took the lead, and we organized this series of presentations into a review paper that functions as a snapshot of renewable bioenergy on marginal lands in New York and the Northeast. And this is just been published. It's available online. It hasn't been come out in print edition. And again, if you would like this, email me. And again, I wanted to bring this this excellent figure from Wei Jiang and Mike Jacobson, showing that marginal lands, it's more than biophysical, and I'm looking forward to the work they're doing at teasing out some of these things that that contribute to marginality of lands and whether they're used and how usable they are for bioenergy. And with that, we will say thank you and open it up to some of these questions.
So Tom Richard has a question. He says, if I understand Peter's cropland to perennial bioenergy estimates, the allocation was greatest where the potential increases of commodity crops was greatest. But aren't those the same regions that are most profitable? Wouldn't an economic model suggest that those are the areas like the Midwest where commodity crops will continue to be grown, and would be the regions where yields are lower like the Northeast, where current cropland may become more economically marginal over time? So this is a very good question, and basically our analysis was focused on, again, trying to estimate the maximum amount of land that might come into play with a very large bioenergy industry. And again, we made an effort to estimate yield and production potential based on biophysical aspects of the land, but we did not really use an economic model whatsoever in our work. So I think the answer based on our work so far is, again, we tried to identify what might be the outermost boundary of land and production potential that could be available, and then much more work needs to be done to determine what fraction of that might be economically viable. So there is some work ongoing within New Bio on that topic. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add, other than it'd be interesting to look at the historical context of what's happened. We've had a lot of land in the Northeast that was, way back when, we were the wheat belt before lands opened up further west. So there's a historical trend that'd be interesting to look at as well.
Well, one quick comment on that historical trend is that we probably have a very similar amount of row crop agriculture that we had 100 years ago or more. And what's gone out of production, again, is this marginal land, the pasture land, the hay land, etc.
Yeah. Peter.
So a specific example of that that's highlighted in another question asks about New Jersey, where there are over 400,000 acres of preserved open space that's currently mostly left to weed growth, Zane points out, but some was originally farmland. Based on the map that you had up, this participant has indicated that it didn't look like you had included that, or did you? This kind of fits into another comment that was made about differences between your methodology and the billion-ton study, which could drive some of the differences between the way different states have been represented. Do you want to touch on those?
Sure. I'll start with the New Jersey example. I can't tell you right now whether those preserved lands were included or not. We tried to exclude lands that we could identify based on available geospatial data as not available for production, but that tended to be primarily federal lands. So a lot of state and local land that may be preserved, we were not necessarily able to capture all of that in our analyses. In other words, we're depending on somebody else having identified those lands as preserved. As far as, so Michelle Mannion had a a question about the differences between the billion ton 2 or the billion ton update study and our results for individual states, and why there are such substantial differences. Again, it comes back to kind of the goals and methodology of the two studies. So again, our goal was to try to say what's the maximum amount of land that might be available without interfering with current agriculture, and what might be the production potential on a fraction of those lands. The billion-ton update study used an economic model. So they are looking at competition between crops based on, essentially economic competition and farmers making a choice of whether to grow commodity agricultural crops or bioenergy crops based on the prices and returns for those. So that's a very broad brush approach. I don't know if I've fully answered that question. I think another aspect of this is there will be local impacts. If you put a facility that's buying a lot of corn grain somewhere, they're going to be happy to buy the local grain production. If you put in a facility that's using switchgrass, they're going to be happy to buy the local production from that. So there will be, there'll be, I think, some spatial impacts about transportation distance, etc. And again, our analysis did not account for any of those factors.
So to continue that line of discussion, there's another question about the way you've accounted for what you're talking about, the way that producers make decisions about what to plant, and trends in markets and how they influence what's going in the ground. So the question asks if you used any USDA Census of Agriculture numbers to look for trends in production acreages of certain crops, for example corn, to compare with your projections of freed up land in the Corn Belt.
Well, we did look at trends in the area of different crops historically over time, but the reason we did that was as part of looking at our regressions of yield trends over time. We did not want to have a regression that represented a huge change in the area of a given crop within a state, because then you're going to have effects of perhaps a different type of land being brought into production. So if I understand the question about sort of whether those historical changes in the area of different crops, whether we were picking that up with our model, if I understand the question right, the answer is we are not predicting what is going to happen in the future. Again, we were trying to identify how much land is there that isn't currently in production. So that analysis was based on remotely sensed data combined with survey data about agricultural production. We're not making a prediction that 5% or 80% of the land that we identified as available could actually come into bioenergy production. We're just saying the land is there and does not seem to be in production now. I guess so Tom Richard had a question I saw. Maybe he had two questions, but he asked about the cropland and where the potential would be. And this is one reason why we looked at the types of land separately. So there may be some differences in what drives changes in production on current croplands from what might drive changes in production on this non-crop herbaceous land.
Right, thanks. He makes the point that, based on what's been discussed, this analysis would be an appropriate one for a national estimate, but that, in certain cases, that this type of division between this emphasis on cropland potential really suggests that the Midwest is really the best place to grow perennial grasses, but for complicated economic reasons, it may not be always true. So.
Yes, and again, I want to emphasize, I think we need, so the analysis that we did, again, was essentially biophysically based. So the conclusion that the Corn Belt is the best place to grow switchgrass is, there's some validity to that, right? It's going to be good land for growing corn and soybeans, is also going to be good land for high productivity switchgrass. These questions of the economics of the return and where you have a competitive advantage for switchgrass versus corn, that is a very important question that is being addressed, I believe, within the New Bio project, but we do not have an answer for that from our analysis to date.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that kind of follows up with the intersection between biophysical and economic production and capacity for these areas. Mike asked us if you could clarify a point in the yield response curve to clarify how critical point is defined. And he asked, why isn't it at extensive margin? So I'm not quite sure I understand that last part of the question, but maybe if you just clarify again how that critical point is determined, okay. That would answer his question.
Well, yeah, for this one, we just went back to the yield response curve. It's the point where there's no additional yield response from a given fertilizer being added, and we just wanted to point that out because you do reach a limit, and there are, and again, I quickly run out of my expertise on this, but people talk about extensive and intensive margins. So for a given soil, you could actually have multiple different yield response and economic response curves that you could draw, depending on whether you're using it intensively or extensively. So if you're trying to grow row crops or you're using it for a far less intensive application. So again, there's a lot more to touch on there. We just wanted to give just a brief overview of this whole approach of looking at things. And before I forget, I see Zane Helsel asked about our switchgrass. So that is, we're using Shawnee. That's a selection out of Caven Rock in all of our field sites.
Mike extends his point by suggesting that in that economic approximation that you offer, there are fixed costs and there are variable costs, but with marginal lands, there are these many other risks and uncertainties that manifest themselves in the way money is spent in an operation. So opportunity costs such as logistics, dealing with equipment bottlenecks, waiting for wetlands to dry to access them with machinery. How should researchers deal with some of those issues in estimations?
Yeah, that's beyond my expertise, but I would refer people back to that Peterson and Galbraith article, because they discuss a lot of these concepts and ideas of risk and an economic level at which you go out of production and a different one at which it's worth it to come into production, and whether or not you've included long-term capital, rebuilding capital for purchasing equipment. It makes for fascinating and very thorough reading, and I'm sure economists have followed up on this since then. And just an interesting side note, so the Galbraith of Peterson and Galbraith is John Kenneth, who went on to become an economic presidential advisor later in his life, I think during the 60s. So at least one case where marginal lands was the stepping stone to fame.
Thanks. If there are any last questions, please feel free to type them in. We still have, I suppose, a little bit of time. But you see in front of you the contact information that was mentioned before for any follow-up questions or discussion. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube site, which will be linked via the New Bio website. You see there right in front of you. So if you want to follow up or remind yourself of any of these points, please feel free to do so.
Okay. And
so speakers, are there any last comments?
no comments other than to say thank you for the invitation. We've enjoyed getting together and throwing these three different perspectives together on this whole question.
I'd also like to thank all of the questioners. The questions were good, and they pointed out that indeed the economic questions do loom large here. You know, we are not economists, so we're trying to, you know, do some of the biophysical analysis and put some boundaries on the limits of the economics, but we definitely agree with the questions that have been raised, that understanding the opportunity costs, the trade-offs of different crops, and you know, where these perennial crops may have some competitive advantage against annual crops. And just to perhaps one word to leave there is, because they're perennials, you have a little more flexibility about when you go in and harvest, and you're not trying to get in there in the spring and getting your tractor wheels stuck trying to plant an annual crop. So there are some solid biophysical reasons to think that some of these marginal lands are more suitable for perennial crops than for annual crops.
Thank you so much. We all certainly appreciate the opportunity to flesh out and consider a lot of those uncertainties and kind of reframe ourselves within this very large and complicated question. So we appreciate your input very much, and what a great presentation.